think I'm not going to be able to share my screen today because I just lost this. So I think I will talk to the audience about Ibogaine. So Ibogaine is a molecule that I've been studying for many, many decades, and it is a molecule that comes from Africa, from the roots of Tabernanthe iboga. And this is used by the indigenous people in Western Equatorial Africa. It has over almost 150 years of ethnobotanical and ethnopharmacologic use. The history of Ibogaine as a use as an anti-addictive potential addiction interrupter was first described in the 1970s by the late Howard Lutzoff, and his work is truly the seminal work which helped to advance this molecule. Am I there? We began our original work with the drug in the academic environment in the early 1990s. And in fact, we went to the FDA and asked for permission to run the first clinical trial. And this was done after I'd had the opportunity to go to Amsterdam to see with my own eyes the very stunning efficacy of Ibogaine as an addiction interrupter. At the time, there was an underground railroad of addicts helping addicts, and people were working with the Dutch Addict Self-Help Movement and the International Coalition of Addict Self-Help. And I saw 3 young men actually detox with Ibogaine on that day, and I was so impressed with what I saw that I came back to the University of Miami, and I asked my colleagues and the scientists and doctors there to help me. And we actually went first to the National Institute on Drug Abuse to seek some funding for these studies. And then again, we continued on where we went to the FDA to get permission. So this was a landmark clinical trial for us. At the same time, we also were able, scientifically doing research in my laboratory, to demonstrate that Ibogaine would be very effective, possibly because it was also converted to an active metabolite. So now we had 2 molecules to study: the medicine from Tabernanthe iboga, from the root, and then also an active metabolite that's formed in the body. The significant advance that has happened with Ibogaine over the last 3 decades was that we were unable to fund this research. And you've heard some of the discussions about working either in the private space or working in not-for-profit organizations who can fund these types of research studies. But I think most of the listeners today in the conference understand that to develop a medicine for the treatment of addiction or depression, to advance a psychedelic into the clinic, costs really $100 million if you go from start to finish, anywhere from $30 million to $100 million if you're working with a new chemical entity. So it's a lot of money, and it's in order to get the kind of regulatory approval to bring these medicines and make them widely available. This is the kind of regulatory and commercial environment that we need to work in. So it makes it very difficult. And indeed, we had no luck in being able to fund this through the academic funding agencies, through the National Institutes of Health. So in 2017, at the height of the opioid epidemic in our country, I decided that it was important to kind of finish what I had started many years ago and to really advance this. And what was significant for us was the opportunity to work with Atai Life Sciences. And in 2019, we signed a joint venture with them so that we could begin to develop Ibogaine for opioid use disorder. Treating opioid addiction today is a problem for many people, because while there are medicines that are approved, like buprenorphine and methadone, which has been available for a very long time, these drugs, these approved drugs, have not ended the opioid epidemic. And in fact, many patients are desperate to break the intractable cycle of their addiction and to not be dependent, not to have a substitution therapy that is going to just continue them in their disease. So in order to break the cycle of opioid dependence, what patients need to do is to become detoxified. And in fact, medically managed withdrawal detoxification may be a necessary first step in recovery of patients who are physically dependent on opioids. And that's why I became so interested in advancing Ibogaine, because I was able to see that patients who were intractable opioid users, people who were banging back a lot of heroin, injecting heroin, patients who had been on methadone maintenance for many, many years, were able, with only a single dose of Ibogaine, to break that intractable cycle. So it was this very profound, rapid reset of this drug, which allowed patients to transition from their opioid dependence. Not only that, the patients were able to become engaged in their own post-withdrawal treatment. In the modern neurosciences, we know that abruptly stopping opioid use results in an uncomfortable cycle of anxiety and dysphoria and depression. And in fact, when you've used opioids for a long time, you go through these intermittent cycles of active use and then withdrawal symptoms. And it's almost as if your brain is being sensitized, and patients become afraid of experiencing the withdrawal. And that's what fuels this intractable cycle. So patients want to discontinue their use, but they can't, because they start to suffer from the withdrawals. And then over time, there's this protracted dysphoria. And this is what keeps people engaged in their active drug use. Opioid use disorder, as with other drug addictions, are an acquired disease. What does that mean? It means that you won't become addicted unless, of course, you're exposed to the drug. But we know that many patients have an underlying risk, whether it's a genetic risk or whether they've had traumas in their life, or whether they have an underlying mood disorder, they suffer from depression, or they have an anxiety. They start to use the drug of choice. They take an opioid, they take that first line of heroin, they take that first pill, the prescription opioid, and they feel better. And so this is how patients get locked in. If you were trying to treat this disorder, how do you do it? You have to understand how opioids hijack the natural endogenous rewarding mechanisms of our brain. Those of us who are not addicted get up in the morning, feel great about what we're doing, and we're on our way with the day. But people who are locked into an intractable cycle of abuse, their ability to derive pleasure from the environment is hijacked by the opioids. I mentioned withdrawal. There's also protracted drug craving and tolerance, and again, this protracted depression. So how does Ibogaine work? How does it work to reset all of these different systems in the brain that have been hijacked by the opioids? Well, we were fortunate, even though we were unable to go forward with our FDA-approved study, to do ex-US work with Ibogaine in an offshore setting. And what we learned from working with the patients in a medical environment with doctors and therapists there to help the patients through the withdrawal management and then to do post-Ibogaine therapeutic integration was that the Ibogaine was very effective in bringing about this rapid reset. And we were able to demonstrate that if you look at the time course, what we call the pharmacokinetics of Ibogaine in the body, that the pharmacokinetics demonstrated that the oniric effects, the psychedelic effects, the waking dream state that patients report for Ibogaine was associated with the duration of the Ibogaine in the blood, but that after the vision would cease, there was an elevation in noribogaine in the bloodstream. So this suggested to us that maybe the noribogaine would also be a beneficial after effect of the Ibogaine therapy, because the noribogaine had a longer half-life in blood, and the patients would have the benefit of having the noribogaine for days after the Ibogaine detoxification, and Ibogaine was cleared from the blood. So we speculate, in fact, that noribogaine may mediate some of these beneficial after effects of Ibogaine detoxification, especially on mood and drug craving. Patients also reported, besides the benefits on their withdrawal symptoms, and this is really stunning efficacy that people have seen in an open label observational study, but also a very abrupt reset on their depression. So mood scores improved, much like is reported for other psychedelics, NMDA, receptor-mediated effects of ketamine, for example. Ibogaine acts on that same neurochemical system. And we speculate that Ibogaine's interaction with the NMDA receptor may be what is beneficial here in bringing about this rapid effect as an antidepressant. Also, patients reported that they didn't crave their drugs. They didn't feel like they needed to go back out and get high. And what was interesting is that they reported more self-confidence. They reported not having the desire, this protracted desire to go back out and get high again. And so this very abrupt addiction interruption was associated with this window. It gave patients a window to face life in a sober state. Very profound for people who had taken Ibogaine in the setting with us in St. Kitts. So the mechanism that's likely involved here includes not only how we think about classical psychedelics, which we know produce their perception-altering effects by acting on certain neural circuits in the brain that use the neurotransmitter serotonin, but also that there are other beneficial effects, receptor targets in the brain that are reset by Ibogaine, and then also that are reset by noribogaine. So Mother Nature's antidote to addicting alkaloids on the planet, opium, cocaine, nicotine, these beneficial effects that patients report seem to be a result of Ibogaine and noribogaine bringing about a change in the neurochemical systems of the brain. What about the oniric effects of Ibogaine? Well, we conducted what is called an elicitation narrative after Ibogaine. Patients who take the Ibogaine do not interact with a therapist during the Ibogaine treatment. Ibogaine, you're quiet, you remain in bed, and you're under a medical monitor. But after the Ibogaine, after the oniric visions, the day later, 2 days later, we asked patients, and what patients told us in a structured interview was that they felt that the drug was useful for their drug problems, that they had been given insight, and they felt that they had a second chance of life. So again, the oniric effects of the drug seem to be part of the benefit. To bring Ibogaine as a medical molecule for the treatment to patients who are desperate to break out of their intractable cycle of addiction, we have to go through the regulatory hurdles. And today, many people take Ibogaine in unsafe settings. There have been adverse events reported. Patients have died because they've bought the drug on the internet. And of course, they're actively abusing other drugs. They may have damaged their heart. There could be issues of drug interaction. Ibogaine, I want to stress today in this forum that Ibogaine needs to be administered by medically trained personnel who have familiarity with the drug. Patients deserve to take the drug in a proper setting with credentialed, licensed medical practitioners. And that's why we at DemeRx, working with the TI, want to develop this as a legitimate medicine to make it available to the many millions of patients who want an alternative, who want to break their cycle of dependence on hardcore drugs like heroin. They deserve it. They deserve to be able to take it in a medically safe setting with people who understand the risks and benefits of this type of therapy. Ibogaine, unlike other psychedelics, has a narrow therapeutic to toxic window. People can get in trouble if they take it in the wrong way, and no one deserves to have that risk. I am really, truly grateful to the organizers for allowing me to participate today. We're very excited at DemeRx, again, to be working with the Thai Life Sciences to develop Ibogaine and its active metabolite as a transition to abstinence-based therapy. Ibogaine is a non-addicting, potentially transformative therapy that can really make a difference for patients. In addition, Neurobiology can be developed, we believe, as an adjunct therapy to help keep that window of sobriety for patients who have been recently detoxified with Ibogaine. And I look forward to starting clinical trials. We're working very hard at DemeRx to do this. And it's wonderful to see the great advancements of MAPS with MDMA as they move towards their phase 3 clinical trials, and the landmark work at Compass with their Psilocybin trials, and to the many other groups that are presenting here today, doing outstanding research in academic institutions, as well as working with groups around the globe to preserve these important plant medicines. Thank you very much.